All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep, like really deep, into the thought of this kind of obscure but super influential figure, Numenius of Apamea.
Oh yeah, Numenius, a Platonist philosopher, right.
Right.
Active around the mid-2nd century CE. And get this, only fragments of his actual writings survive. It's like working with pieces of a puzzle, trying to reconstruct his philosophical vision.
A puzzle indeed. But even those fragments reveal a thinker who had a major impact on later Platonism, Plotinus especially, and even early Christian thinkers.
No doubt about it. He offers a unique window, right, into how Platonist thought was developing during this, intellectually fertile period.
So think of it like this. We're playing detective, sifting through ancient texts, trying to piece together Numenius's ideas. We primarily rely on these fragments, and we'll use FR as shorthand to cover both direct quotes and reports about his views. And our main source for those fragments is a Christian writer, Eusebius.
And, of course, we can't forget other sources, like Origen, Porphyry, Plutinus's student, remember Chalcidius, Macrobius, and Proclus. All these figures give us further clues about Numenius's thought.
Absolutely, like pieces of a puzzle. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to rebuild, as much as we can, the core of Numenius's philosophy.
Right.
What would he think about reality? How did he see the connection between Plato and Pythagoreanism? And what lasting influence did he leave on Western thought?
You got it. We're on a quest to understand this fascinating, yet often overlooked figure in the history of philosophy.
All right, let's start with the man himself. Who was Numenius? Now, biographical details are pretty scarce. We know he's linked to Apamea in Syria, but there's also a Roman connection.
Right. You've got Emilius, a student of Plotinus, calling him Apamean, but then you have John Lytus referring to him as the Roman. It's almost like he had a double life.
It's a bit of a mystery. So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory geographical tags?
Well, the most likely scenario, at least according to scholars, is that he was born in Apamea but later ended up teaching in Rome. That would explain his exposure to a mix of intellectual currents, including Eastern influences. And hey, maybe it even paved the way for someone like Plotinus to head to Rome later on.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, when it comes to pinning down when he was active, scholars generally place him around the mid-2nd century CE. We have Proclus, arranging his Platonist timeline, putting Numenius before Atticus, who reached his philosophical peak around 176 CE.
Right. And then we have Clement of Alexandria mentioning Numenius. And Numenius himself even refers to Mnasius, a physician from the 1st century CE. Plus, there's this really interesting connection with the Chaldean oracles, a set of texts from around 161, 180 CE.
The Chaldean oracles. Now, that's a topic for another deep dive, maybe, but it does raise a question about the direction of influence. Did Numenius draw on these oracles, or were they both tapping into a similar intellectual wellspring?
It's a fascinating puzzle, really. Shows how interwoven philosophical and religious thought was in that era. Did they influence each other, or were they developing in parallel?
So much to unpack there. Okay, let's talk about his books, or at least the ones we know about. There's On the Good, a weighty work with at least 6 books.
Huge. And in it, he really grapples with the fundamental questions of existence, like what is being? He talks about the first principle, which he sees as divine, the ultimate cause of everything, the source of all goodness, clearly inspired by Plato's form of the good and that whole goodness of the demiurge thing.
But he didn't just, equate them.
No. He was way more subtle than that. He really delved into those ideas, trying to refine our understanding of them. And it seems like this work may have been written as a dialogue. Imagine trying to read a 6-book dialogue.
Must have been quite a read.
Okay.
Then we have On the Indestructibility of the Soul, at least 2 books on that topic.
This one's a bit trickier. We don't have a lot of direct testimony about its content, but, many scholars believe that later Platonists, when they were talking about the soul, they were building on ideas that Numenius probably laid out in this work.
Right, like an intellectual foundation. Okay, and then there's On Plato's Secret Doctrines. Now, the content of this one is still very much debated. Some scholars think it might have dealt with allegorical interpretations of Plato's dialogues, even maybe looking at Hesiod's theogony through the lens of Plato's Cratylus.
Others suggest he might have argued that some of Plato's core teachings, the ones we think of as quintessentially Platonic, actually came from Pythagoreanism. Talk about a plot twist.
Wow, hidden origins. That would be something.
It really gets you thinking about how Numenius was trying to, unearth the deeper layers of Plato's philosophy to find those hidden meanings and connections. It was almost like a secret code he was trying to crack.
I like that, the secret code of Plato. Okay, now we get to a work with a bit more documentation, thanks to good old Eusebius, on the dissension of the academics from Plato.
Yeah, Eusebius really hooked us up here with 5 big excerpts. And in this work, Numenius is clearly taking issue with the skeptical academics, those who followed Plato but embraced skepticism.
Yeah, they'd strayed from the true path,
Right.
especially when it came to the doctrine of first principles, those fundamental truth which he saw laid out in the pseudo-Platonic second letter.
Exactly. For Numenius, the skeptical academics were like, you're missing the point. Plato wasn't about doubting everything.
It shows how much he cared about the history of Platonism and how strongly he reacted against these skeptical readings of Plato.
For sure. And it's not just about interpreting Plato correctly. It reflects a larger debate happening at the time about, what is authentic Platonism? Who are Plato's true heirs?
Super interesting. Okay, we also have titles of some other works, epops, on numbers, and on place mentioned by Origen. But sadly, that's all we have. Now, when ancient sources describe Numenius, they call him both a Platonist and a Pythagorean.
Double whammy.
Now, to modern ears, that might sound a bit contradictory, but how did Numenius himself reconcile these two philosophical labels?
Well, for thinkers like Numenius, living in that Middle Platonic era, seeing themselves as both a Platonist and a Pythagorean wasn't a contradiction at all. It was like saying, I love pizza and I love pasta.
Italian food all around.
Exactly. Just like Eudorus and Moderatus before him, Numenius was what we call a Pythagorean Platonist. He fully accepted both Pythagoras and Plato as authorities, but he did have this ranking system. He saw Plato's authority as sort of borrowed, ultimately stemming from the wisdom of Pythagoras.
So Pythagoras was like the OG philosopher, the original source, and Plato was the interpreter.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Numenius believed that true philosophical insight, that deep fundamental wisdom flowed from Pythagoras, and, well, Plato took those Pythagorean ideas and wrote them down, gave them a more permanent form.
And this distinction between, the spoken word, those original Pythagorean teachings, and the written word, Plato's writings, played a big role in how Numenius viewed philosophical history and authority.
For sure. The origin and transmission of knowledge were super important to him.
And this all ties into his broader view of the history of philosophy, right? He believed that true philosophical truths were a kind of revelation of logos, this universal reason.
A universal reason. And Numenius believed it was shared by all nations, but expressed most clearly by those inspired individuals, those who really tapped into that source of wisdom.
He even thought that the religious practices of different cultures contained philosophical truths that could be reinterpreted philosophically. This sounds a bit like, Posidonius, Plutarch, those guys.
Yeah, you're spot on. Numenius totally shared that perspective with those thinkers. He saw a fundamental wisdom underlying the diverse beliefs and practices of different cultures. Which, by the way, explains why he was so interested in Eastern traditions, even Judaism.
Ah, that's fascinating. So in the Greek philosophical landscape, Pythagoras was like the primary revealer of this universal logos. And Plato basically adopted and presented those Pythagorean ideas within his own philosophical framework.
Right. And Numenius goes even further. He suggests that Plato got those Pythagorean ideas both directly and indirectly, directly from Pythagorean sources, but also through Socrates, who he considered a Pythagorean too.
Wait, Socrates, a Pythagorean, that's not how we usually think of him.
I know, right? It's totally different from how some folks back then saw Socrates, like as a precursor to skepticism, which Plato then, moved away from. But for Numenius, it's the opposite. Plato's authority comes from faithfully transmitting those Pythagorean doctrines, both through his own studies and through the teachings of Socrates, the Pythagorean, which means Plato's writings become, well, a secondary source.
Yeah. So if you really want to understand Plato, you got to go back to the original Pythagorean source.
Exactly.
And because he saw Plato's authority as derived, Numenius actually encourages us to turn away from Plato, to go beyond him and revisit the original teachings of Pythagoras. He sets up this kind of, hierarchy of philosophical authority.
A philosophical pecking order.
Yeah. It starts with those ancient wise figures like Pythagoras, then it moves down to Socrates, then Plato, and then it's all downhill from there with Plato's successors in the academy. They're going to drop the ball, according to Numenius.
Right, like they messed up the legacy.
And he even suggests that Plato himself bears some responsibility for the way things turned out in the academy. He felt that Plato wasn't, explicit enough about his Pythagorean roots, which led later Platonists to misinterpret him and, go astray.
Yeah, he wasn't clear enough about where he was getting his ideas from.
So his criticism of Plato wasn't that Plato was wrong. It was more like, hey, Plato, you should have given Pythagoras more credit. You weren't clear enough about your sources. And this whole emphasis on the Pythagorean foundation of Plato's thought was part of a broader Pythagorean revival happening in the first 2 centuries CE.
A Pythagorean comeback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you have all these new texts popping up, claiming to be by ancient Pythagoreans trying to boost their authority. And then you have Moderatus attempting to present Pythagoreanism as this systematic, coherent philosophy.
Yeah, trying to put it all together and make it a real system. And, it's interesting because this connection between Plato and Pythagoras, it wasn't something Numenius just came up with. People were already talking about it even back in Aristotle's day. Aristotle even suggested that Plato basically stole parts of the Timaeus from Philolaus, a Pythagorean.
Oh, philosophical plagiarism.
Yeah.
Scandalous.
Right. And this renewed interest in the Timaeus by Pythagorean Platonists, it totally makes sense if they saw it as this key text for transmitting Pythagorean doctrines.
The Timaeus, the secret Pythagorean handbook.
Totally.
Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about Numenius's metaphysics, his view of reality. Like Plato and Aristotle, he was fascinated by questions of being, what is questions? What exists? What's the nature of the divine?
It's a big question.
Exactly. And his treatise on the good seems to be the central text here. It delves into, the core of existence in a way that echoes Aristotle, but it's definitely guided by Plato's Timaeus.
The Timaeus again.
Yep. He puts forward this idea of the good as the ultimate principle, the top of the hierarchy from which all these lower and intermediate divine principles emanate.
Like a cascading waterfall of goodness.
Exactly. Now, Numenius, being a good Platonist, maintains this sharp divide between the sensible world, the world of change and becoming, which we perceive through our senses, and the intelligible world, the world of true, unchanging being.
Two realms, totally separate.
Right. And on the good, he lays out this ascent, an ontological ascent, like climbing a ladder, starting from those sensible things we experience every day and going up to those perfect blueprints, the forms. And at the very top, the peak of the ladder, is the first principle, the good.
The ultimate goal.
Yes. And for Numenius, this good is also God. And everything else depends on it, gets its goodness from it.
Totally reliant.
And get this, he actually criticizes those traditional material elements, earth, fire, water, air. He says they can't truly be considered being in the fullest sense.
Whoa.
Why? Because they're constantly changing, combining, breaking apart.
Yeah, like they're never stable.
Right. And for something to have true unified existence, Numenius thinks it needs an intelligible power, like a soul, to hold it together. This sounds kind of like the world soul from Plato's Timaeus.
The Timaeus pops up again. It's everywhere.
I know, right? Now here's where things get really interesting. Numenius has a very particular view of matter. He bases it on a very literal reading of Plato's Timaeus, particularly the idea of the receptacle, that place where becoming occurs. And he says matter is uncreated, co-eternal with God, but totally separate from the divine.
Like God's weird, messy neighbor.
Uh-huh. Yeah, maybe. He describes matter as this unlimited, indefinite, fluid thing with no form, no qualities, essentially a state of non-being. He even calls it a logos without reason.
Wow. Reasonless matter.
Yeah. And aligning with the whole Pythagorean Platonist tradition, he connects this formless matter to the indefinite dyad, a fundamental principle in Pythagorean cosmology.
So it's not just Plato. He's bringing in Pythagorean ideas here, too.
Exactly, weaving it all together. And listen, this matter isn't just like neutral stuff hanging around. Numenius considers it inherently negative, disordered, tactos. It's the source of all badness and disorder in the cosmos.
Matter. The cosmic bad guy.
Yeah. And Chalcidius, that commentator we mentioned earlier, even suggests that matter might be the evil world soul itself, like it has its own kind of life, maybe even a soul of matter. This paints a pretty dualistic picture of reality, right? Good versus evil, order versus chaos.
Dualism, for sure. And it was a view that Numenius shared with other Middle Platonists, folks like Plutarch and Atticus. They were reacting against some of those more monistic Pythagorean views, where the one, or God, is seen as the source of everything, even the bad stuff.
That makes sense. They wanted to protect God's, ultimate goodness.
Absolutely. But even with this negativity attached to matter, Numenius still believes the world as a whole is good. Why? Because it's ordered, structured by the highest principle, by God, who's actively opposing all that chaotic matter. He's like, don't worry, I got this.
God's got our back.
Exactly. And in Numenius' system, this whole matter thing, it exists at the level of the second God, the demiurge, who's in charge of providence and ordering the cosmos.
So matter is the demiurge's problem to deal with.
Pretty much.
So only those intelligible things, those forms and that highest good, have true being and bring order and goodness. And the order we see in the world, well, That requires a supremely good entity to make it happen. And that entity for Numenius is the form of the good, the highest God,
It all comes back to the good.
always. And he basically sets up two fundamental sources of reality, God the good and matter. And matter's in opposition to the demiurge, not directly to the highest God.
Right, like a chain of command.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole multiple gods thing. Numenius talks about two, and maybe even three, distinct gods or divine principles. He makes a clear distinction between the demiurge, the creator who orders matter, and the highest God, who's above all that.
Like a cosmic CEO.
Maybe. This highest God is the first intellect, totally simple, inactive in the creation process. He's being itself, autoon, literally, being itself, which is even more fundamental than the idea of goodness.
Huh?
He's the ultimate source of being and absolute goodness, and Numenius connects him with Plato's form of the good. But here's the twist he's actually being, unlike in Cato's Republic, where the good is beyond being.
That's a big difference.
Huge. And Numenius even uses that biblical phrase from Exodus 3.14, Hon I am who I am, to describe this highest God.
Whoa, bringing in the Bible now.
He's drawing from all over the place. And this highest deity, he's all alone, isolated. Sounds a lot like Platonism one, right?
Totally, like a cosmic hermit.
And then you have the demiurge, the second God, the one responsible for creation, but distinct from and dependent on the first God. Numenius says the first God kind of brought forth the second God and uses him as a tool for thinking and creating.
Like an extension of himself.
Yeah, maybe. And this second God, this demiurge, he contemplates the forms and creates by imposing them on matter. And within himself, he contains all those forms.
He's like a walking library of forms.
Oh, yeah.
So the first God, even though he's inactive, he still causes things. Right. He causes the demiurge, who then goes on to cause everything else.
Right, like a chain reaction.
The demiurge needs the first God to, give him his being and his goodness. And the first God, in a way, needs the demiurge so that his goodness and those forms can actually do something, make a world.
So they need each other in a way.
In a weird cosmic way.
And this first God, like Aristotle's unmoved mover, probably only thinks about himself, stays simple, pure, at rest. Meanwhile, the second God is all about motion, complexity, because he's got all those forms. And he's good because of his relationship. It's like imitating the first God.
Yeah, like anything you can do, I can do too, but slightly worse.
Right. And now, get this. When the demiurge starts creating, when he gets his hands dirty with matter, he splits into two parts. And there might even be a third divine principle or intellect involved in all this, one that thinks in a more, step-by-step way, actually applying the forms to matter.
Whoa, so many gods.
I know. This third one is kind of like the world soul from the Timaeus, the one that brings order to the material world.
So the demiurge gets inspired by matter, right? Like matter makes him want to create, to impose order. But matter is also super chaotic and unruly. So the demiurge splits. One part focusing on the forms, the other dealing with matter. And then the third God, the world soul, steps in to help keep everything in order.
That's a lot to keep track of. And to explain it all, Numenius uses this metaphor, likening the demiurge to a helmsman steering a ship, using the forms as his navigational tools.
The cosmic ship captain.
Exactly. And this world soul, this third principle, it keeps everything running, keeps the world going. It desires to create because, order is good. And in the end, this third principle almost becomes a world itself, which reminds us of the Timaeus again. But whether Numenius really thought there were three distinct gods or just two is still debated. Some people, like Proclus, thought it was three, but others, based on what Eusebius says, lean towards two.
Yeah, it's tricky. Numenius himself says that the second and third gods are one in some way, but the first God, he's totally different. And this whole splitting within the demiurge, it seems to be because of his contact with matter.
Right, like it corrupts him somehow.
Yeah, maybe. And
this unity between the second and third gods doesn't necessarily mean they're identical. They have different roles to play. But considering how much those early Christians liked Numenius' theology, it's likely he was thinking of three separate gods.
Yeah, the Christians probably wouldn't have been so into it if it was just two.
Okay, so we have these three gods, the first one being the principle of being, and the second and third being the principles of creation. And goodness flows from that highest God down through the second and third and into the world, all without the first God lifting a finger.
Like a divine relay race.
Now let's dive into Numenius' psychology, his view of the soul. He talks about this a lot in On the Good. And, well, his views on the soul were a big deal for later Platonists. They really grappled with his ideas.
He was a trendsetter.
Totally. One of the main things he does is draw this parallel between how the soul relates to the body and how the intelligible world relates to the sensible world.
Like a microcosm of the bigger picture.
Porphyry tells us that Numenius had this idea of two souls, a rational soul, which humans and gods share, and a non-rational soul, which animals have. And then you have Philoponus suggesting that there might even be a third vegetative soul.
A soul for plants.
Why not? Right. This lines up with the three parts of the soul in the Timaeus and fits with how much Numenius relied on that dialogue.
The Timaeus, always the Timaeus.
Right. Okay, and Porphyry also mentions that the rational soul has this, like, assenting faculty.
Assenting faculty. Fancy.
It plays a key role in motivating our actions. And it actually sounds a bit like Stoic ideas about reason being the guiding principle for adult human souls.
Yeah, a bit of Stoic influence there.
Iamblichus then goes on to elaborate on this distinction, saying there's this fundamental opposition between the rational or intellectual soul, the essence of the gods, and the non-rational soul.
Two souls at war.
Right. And Numenius says humans have both the rational soul, which is divine and immortal, and the non-rational soul, which is connected to the body and mirrors the evil world soul. And the Iamblichus and Proclus say that evil actually enters the human soul through its connection with matter.
Yikes. Matter's bad news for the soul.
For sure. And what really makes souls different is whether or not they have reason. That's the key distinction.
Reason, it's what separates us from the animals and the plants.
Exactly. But get this. Numenius says things like perception, memory, and desire. They're not essential to the soul's true nature. They're like add-ons that come with having a body.
Like optional extras.
Exactly. The soul's true nature is as intellect. And he believed that the human soul is basically an intellect that descends through the planets to become embodied.
A cosmic road trip.
This idea of the soul's descent, it's found in other sources too, like Celsus, Hermetic texts, and Origen. And when this intellectual soul falls into a body, it picks up all those extra functions, but it still have the potential to go back up, to return to its intellectual origins.
Like a homing beacon.
I like that. And this whole descent thing, it was heavily influenced by Plato's analogies, like the cave and the image of Glaucus, the sea god covered in barnacles, weighed down, and also the creation of the soul in the Timaeus.
The Timaeus always popping up.
It's the gift that keeps on giving. And Porphyry, in his Cave of the Nymphs, he builds on Numenius' interpretation of this descent. For him, it's all those earthly pleasures that draw the soul down, keep it stuck here.
The siren song of the material world.
So the soul needs to be liberated, to turn back towards its true intellectual self.
Break free.
Now, Macrobius gives us a much more detailed picture of this descent. He explains how the soul gets different capacities as it passes through each planetary sphere.
Like a cosmic training program.
Right. Theoretical thinking from Saturn, practical activity from Jupiter, spiritedness from Mars, perception and imagination from the Sun, appetites from Venus, language from Mercury, and finally, vegetative functions from the Moon.
Wow, that's a lot of baggage.
I know, right? And these acquired capacities, they actually line up with the 7 parts of the soul in Stoic philosophy. But Numenius doesn't think they're essential. They're not part of the soul's true nature as intellect.
So they're more like temporary accessories.
Yeah, and they can actually be sources of evil because they cause the soul to lose its original simplicity and purity. All that astral matter it picks up along the way, it weighs the soul down. So for Numenius and other folks like Cronius and Harpaquation, embodiment, being stuck in a body, is always bad for the soul.
Bummer.
Now, what happens to the soul after death? Numenius says that at death, what truly survives is the soul's essence, the intellect. This raises the question, is only the intellect immortal, or do those other parts of the soul stick around too?
That's a good question. Like, what happens to all that baggage?
Right. Some sources, like Damascus, suggest that the whole ensouled condition survives.
Yeah.
And then you have Philoponus, who says that all soul is immortal, referring to Plato's Phaedrus. So maybe Numenius was thinking that the intellect that's always alive, always divine.
It's the core, the indestructible part.
Right. But those non-rational capacities, maybe they fade away, dissolve back into the cosmos. Porphyry's later views seem to agree with this. So for Numenius, the soul is fundamentally immortal in its essence, as intellect. It can be free from the body and all that astral matter it picked up along the way.
Freedom.
And when it comes to reincarnation, Numenius thought that the rational soul could be reborn into other bodies, even animal bodies, as a kind of punishment for bad deeds.
Karma for the soul.
Okay, let's wrap up by talking about Numenius's influence. This guy had a huge impact on other philosophers, both pagan and Christian. I mean, Plotinus was clearly influenced by him, so much so that his own students had to defend him against charges of plagiarism.
Yeah, Aemilius even wrote a whole treatise on the differences between their views, and then you have Longinus claiming that Plotinus was, like, the superior thinker. But come on, the similarities are undeniable. Three intelligible principles, matter as a source of evil, though with some differences, goodness flowing out into the world, the human soul being essentially intellect.
Yeah, a lot of overlap there. And it wasn't just Plotinus. Aemilius and Porphyry, they were also influenced by Numenius. Aemilius took up that idea of participation extending into the intelligible realm, and Porphyry's whole psychology was heavily shaped by Numenius. Proclus even accused Porphyry of, like, stealing Numenius's ideas on demons.
Demons, always gotta have demons.
But what's even more interesting is how Numenius was received by early Christians.
Hmm.
I mean, figures like Origen and Eusebius, they really liked him. They appreciated his respect for Jewish tradition, his allegorical interpretations of Moses in the Old Testament, and his famous line about Plato being an Atticizing Moses.
Atticizing Moses, I love that.
They saw him as bridging Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture. And they even pointed out allusions in his work that they thought referred to Jesus, Moses, and Egyptian sages.
They're like, see, this guy was almost a Christian.
Right. They saw him as having this idea of three divine principles, which they interpreted as a foreshadowing of the Trinity.
Pre-Christian Christianity.
Exactly. This allowed them to argue that Christianity wasn't this brand new thing.
Yeah.
It had roots in ancient wisdom, even in pagan philosophy like Plato, as seen through Numenius's eyes.
Yeah, they were trying to show that Christianity wasn't so radical, that it had a long and distinguished history.
Origen was especially taken by Numenius's distinction between that highest, transcendent God and the lower creator God. It helped him preserve God's absolute immutability. And then you have Eusebius, who used Numenius's critique of those skeptical academics to argue that pagan philosophy, at least without Plato, couldn't really reach truth.
So even though they were Christian, they were still using Numenius to engage in debates within pagan philosophy.
It was all connected. Now, later Platonists, folks like Iamblichus, Proclus, Syrianus, Philoponus, and Damascus, they all grappled with Numenius's ideas, though not always agreeing with him. Proclus, for example, wasn't a fan of his distinction between the first and second gods.
Too many gods for Proclus.
He thought Numenius didn't fully grasp how totally transcendent that first principle was, and he sometimes mixed up its functions with those of the demiurge. He even lumped Numenius in with Atticus and Harpocration in his critique of their understanding of the demiurge.
Guilty by association.
Chalcidius, however, leaned heavily on Numenius in his commentary on the Timaeus, especially when talking about matter. And there are some interesting parallels between Numenius's three gods and Chalcidius's own theological framework.
More multiple gods.
Right. And even Macrobius mentions Numenius in his Somnium Scipionis, maybe talking about the soul's descent, though it's not entirely clear how much he was influenced by him.
So despite being relatively unknown, Numenius had a massive impact.
Right. He was this pivotal figure in Middle Platonism. He tried to bring together Plato and Pythagoras, create this complex metaphysical system with its multiple levels of divinity, and presented these really intricate ideas about the soul and its cosmic journey.
He was a philosophical trailblazer.
His influence, it really stretched across centuries, from Plotinus and Neoplatonism to early Christian thought and beyond. His ideas sparked all these debates and left a mark on Western intellectual history that we're still uncovering today.
And that brings us to a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to ponder. This tension that Numenius saw between Plato and his later followers, does it still exist today? In our own philosophical journeys, as we try to grasp those fundamental truths, do we inevitably end up reinterpreting and even diverging from those who came before us? It's a question worth thinking about as you explore the rich and ever-evolving world of philosophy.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Numenius of Apamea. Until next time.